Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren King. Darren, fall is here. It's kind of hit us with a bit of a cudgel all of a sudden. It's extremely cold outside, which I like. I like it when it gets cold, but it really happened almost overnight. It went from being really comfortable where we are to just plummeting temperatures, changes in the air. It's getting darker earlier. All these things are happening. And I bring all this up because I think it's just an interesting time of the year where almost your body forgets that these things happen, that we kind of get through this period of surprise. Like, oh, the world does this. And it's starting to go through this process of decay and change. And that makes us, I think, reflect a little bit on our place in the world as well. What's been going through your mind? What you've been up to lately?
Well, it's a good analogy because I think a lot of us are thinking about this sense that there are changes underway in our world, in our reality. And the change of the seasons is an apt reminder of that because, like you said, I remember, 3-4 days ago, riding my Ninja down in Georgia and it being basically 80 degrees and then getting well below freezing overnight, and that kind of shock to the system, right, initially. Yeah, and that kind of reminds us that there seems to be changes going on, not just in terms of our societal march towards some version of disclosure, which we'll get into again, but just in terms of this sense that many experiencers have, many who have experiences with psi phenomena and encounters with non-human intelligence and altered state experiences, just many people sensing that something is changing, something is shifting, that the change is already underway to some degree, some sort of transformation. Not necessarily the ending or the beginning, but just some sort of transformation in terms of the fabric of reality almost, which is very, very interesting. And this is all happening at the same time in the midst of, as we've said on recent episodes, in the midst of a seemingly very destabilized world where there are conflicts happening everywhere, turmoil happening everywhere. Just today, I saw this meme on Twitter/X. It was that mirror, in a car, which says objects are closer than they appear. And the lettering on the mirror was World War III.
Jeez.
So it's that kind of thinking, right? There's this kind of sense that people are going about their lives because people have busy lives they're occupied with and responsibilities they have to adhere to, while at the same time there's this sense that the whole thing is a powder keg as well at the same time.
Yeah, we've been so accustomed to being told to just keep swimming when the world all around us feels like it's falling apart. If you have a corporate job, it's basically like, pretend that that's not happening. You still got to get your reports done. You still got to get through your meetings.
You need to park it so you can come up and be productive. Exactly.
Did you read that memo we sent? I think this is an excellent place to start, and particularly with, what you touched on there. There's a lot of change in the air. Speaking of change and doing things maybe a little bit differently, I want, before we jump into some of the topics, as you know, very recently I had an opportunity to do a saltwater float. It was in a dark tank. If you've never done that, basically what you do is you get into a tank that's about 1.5 feet deep of water that's so salinated that you float. You could literally fall asleep in there. You could, without drowning, it'd be hard to drown. It's that you're that buoyant. And in that room, it's completely black. So there's no light whatsoever. And you generally put earplugs in to keep the water out of your ears. So it's basically sensory deprivation. So I bring this up to say that I've done this a couple of times, and one of the weird things about it is how time itself becomes very malleable in that kind of state. And I say that related to this particular episode because I want you to think about where you are right now, what you're listening to, what you're bringing to this conversation. Don't think about the time, just think about your presence to this material and how it affects you in this moment, but also how it makes you reflect both into your past and look ahead into your future. Because I think we're going to touch on areas here that get at the heart of this notion that our experience of time, our experience of space, our experience of causality is perhaps somewhat wrong. So Darren, I don't know what you think about me setting the table with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are all aware that time does seem to change in terms of our experience of it. We say when we're having fun, time's flying. And when, it's 4:30 and you get off at 5, it just feels like every minute is crawling like it takes 5 minutes. We kind of dismiss that as just a byproduct of our faulty perception, rather than asking the question, is time altogether a byproduct of our perceptual set, our evolutionarily derived apparatus by which we make our way through the world, as opposed to a thing unto itself? And reality seems to be pointing in that direction, that space-time is just not a thing, not just time, but space-time altogether. That's part of the extension that we experience, that we walk through, that we are, as Bernardo said in my conversation with him, like fish swimming in water. We don't see the water because we're immersed in it. So we're immersed in space-time. That's our experience. We all experience it together, which makes it even more of a convincing illusion or delusion. And yes, absolutely, what's coming out of cutting-edge physics and what's coming out of the implications of the UFO phenomena, psi phenomena, all these different aspects, near-death experience, out-of-body experience, on-a-goes, altered state experiences, all of these different kinds of modalities are pointing towards something fundamental about space-time.
All right, so before we dunk everybody in the deep end, we're going to do a little bit of a retrospective on some current events. We like talking a little bit about things that have been happening since the last time we spoke. So we're going to walk through some of those highlights. Darren, I want to start with the skiff. All right. We're not going to skip the skiff. That was, I don't know, kind of a wet blanket for many. For you and I don't think it was particularly surprising. It was surprising in the sense that it was surprising to me that many of the lawmakers got in the skiff and were upset that they didn't have the clearances to hear certain pieces of information. And they just thought that magically they'd have those clearances by walking in the room. I wasn't very, very surprised by that at all. I didn't think we'd really get much out of that conversation. And that turns out to be exactly what happened. So what was your take on the skiff? And are we really ever going to get anything of valuable essence or substance out of a skiff conversation with some inspector general types?
Right. Well, just to give people some context here, so during Dave Grush's testimony, he said over and over again, I can't answer that publicly, but I'd be happy to address that in a skiff for people, personnel with the appropriate clearances. He did say that. He didn't just say skiff as if it's some sort of magic chamber, like you get behind the curtain and the Wizard of Oz is there and you get to know everything you want to know. It doesn't work that way. You have to divulge this information in a skiff, but that alone is not the only criteria. You actually have to have the clearances, the requisite clearances, to be able to hear those revelations within the skiff. So you can't talk about those things outside of a skiff, but even within a skiff, you have to have the right clearances, the right need to knows to be able to hear the information. And like you pointed to, what's a bit surprising is not that it didn't go as planned, that it wasn't just this miracle of now I know everything and I'm ready to spill the beans to the public, but that the Congress people involved didn't check beforehand to see what kind of clearances were required, how much they were likely to find out or not. So instead you had kind of this sad face demeanor afterwards. Nothing really happened. It was kind of disappointing. We were told we didn't have the clearances to know many of the answers to the questions we asked. How that doesn't get covered beforehand, you and I were kind of joking about this before we went on the air, not because it's funny in itself, but just because it feels a bit like Keystone Cops. Like, how do they not know that going in? Like you pointed out, some of these people are very green behind the ears. They're very new to congressional circles and maybe aren't aware of these things. And we talked about, to some degree, even though they are like the heroes to many people on UFO Twitter or UFO X, many of these people are like first-year UFO Twitter people, right? So they are not likely going to be the ones that have enough context and contextual understanding of the history and the breadth involved here to really be doing the work they need to be doing. And if anything, it's going to take them a few years, just like it did many of us in social media, to really realize how deep this rabbit hole goes. All that is to say, like you said, not surprising, actually. If anything, the only surprise is that there wasn't more understanding going into the skiff situation.
Yes. It's interesting to see that often the most zealous folks are kind of the ones with the least experience. The ones who say the least, people like Marco Rubio and Mark Warner, people that are, been around for a while and are privy to some of these higher level conversations. They're pretty guarded in what they say, and they're not out constantly in front of the camera and doing podcasts advocating for getting those secrets dadgummit, you know?
Exactly. And those are the people actually involved with the Gang of Eight, right? So they're the ones that actually have the understanding of the deeper revelations here. And yes, they are much more self-aware about what they say. They seem very calculated in what they say. They definitely seem to be rolling out little by little tidbits that are meant to prep the American public. But they are not the ones saying disclosure is going to happen like Tuesday, what, you know, on my watch kind of thing. They're actually playing much more of a long game. They are saying things of import, but I think because they understand some of the real ramifications here, the repercussions, they are much more cautious, and they seem to be playing more of a long game than what we're hearing from some of these newer congressional people.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say about it too is the one silver lining with this disappointing episode is I believe it's only whetting the appetite of those who didn't get the answers that they wanted. You can understand that secrecy, that pushback, and you've got that level of expectation coming into that experience, and then you're told you can't get the information. That's only going to make you more curious and push that further if you can. And I think that's what we're seeing. Tim Burchett certainly seems like a guy who doesn't want to let this go and really wants to get something. And we've heard rumors of additional hearings that are very likely to come to pass even before the end of the year. So that will be very interesting. And I think that gets fed into the media cycle as well, that these things are taking place. Not a lot of answers are being revealed. That can add to a cycle of interest and intrigue because we're waiting on what those answers might be.
Indeed. And I think what's interesting too is how the word culture comes up here, because in American society, the military-industrial complex plays a very central role. And most Americans are proud of the fact that we have this world-class defense infrastructure that is leagues beyond any other nation, especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union. But as many people have pointed out, and even Rubio, speaking of Rubio, has been one of the people I think who's made comments to this, where he's basically said it seems to function sometimes almost like a government body of its own without any kind of jurisdiction control or any kind of real democratic assessment or intervention or oversight by Congress or the people elected by the American people. So you have this interesting interplay where, on the one hand, most people do trust the fact that we need to have a really secure state, and we are kind of like the world's policemen. People have different views about how much that's an appropriate stance to take or not. But what I'm getting at here is that one of the implications of disclosure, of course, there's many, we keep pointing this out, this is not a simple matter, is unraveling the nature and the extent and the duration of this massive operation that's been going on behind the scenes without democratic oversight involving the military-industrial complex. We've talked about this before. But again, you have to ask, even before you get to the global implications, what does that do to the spirit of a nation when they find that there's this basically operating governmental structure that answers to no one, that is so powerful that you could even ask the question, could it resist the nation that tries to control it at some point? If we try to reel it in, will we be able to at that point? You heard about in some other countries, again, we think about more developing countries and whatnot, where you basically have a coup, and then the military basically says, listen, we have all the tanks, we have the jets, we have the guns, we're taking over, what are you going to do about it? What is the American public going to do about it if the military-industrial complex, when this lid gets taken off and we see the beast that it is potentially, what happens then? Is that a moment of reckoning? Or is that a moment of civil strife, if not civil war? These are really interesting questions that are baked into this matter of disclosure.
Absolutely. All right, well, moving on to other topics. Very recently, we heard that AARO, in their amazing website, they finally added a web form where you can submit information that you might have related to one of these classified reverse engineering programs, SAPs. You can get in touch with them, and they can, I guess, somehow set up a meeting with you to get the information that you have. The whole process, Darren, to me seems kind of strange and clunky and in many ways not very secure at all, and not the way that I would necessarily want to put my name forward to an organization like this through a web form just out there on the internet. Maybe it's secure. I'm not sure that it is. So is this a positive move in the right direction, particularly as we've been hearing that there's been a lack of faith in AARO itself and Sean Kirkpatrick in particular?
Indeed. And if nothing else, even if it is a move by him that is meant to do the right thing, and again, that's an open question, which we can get into in a little bit, but the manner in which it's being done, again, is really questionable, because generally, if you're soliciting national security secrets or revelations to do with matters that could challenge our fundamental understanding of reality and us being alone in the cosmos and those kinds of things, even to the point where you're talking about people who might have national security secrets that at one point they were forbidden to disclose because of NDAs, but now based on new legislation, they can actually get around that. But you really want them to submit that on a form on a website? In this day and age, when you've got AI crawlers, you're basically advertising to China, to Russia, to our various adversaries. If you want to crack the system, this is the form you want to do it on. Generally, you don't advertise to your adversaries exactly where all this top secret information is going to be divulged. It just, again, makes you wonder what is really going on there. Is it a farce just because on the face of it, it looks like that would not be a very secure way to handle things whatsoever?
It feels like checking the box. You told us we needed a form on a website. Here's our website. Here's the form.
Please make sure you fill out the CAPTCHA so we know that you're not a bot before you disclose national security secrets.
Exactly. Yeah, it doesn't seem to me anyway to be the safest way to do it, particularly when these programs, alleged programs, are so in the black that no one even knows they exist. So putting your name out there in a way like this, coming out of that level of secrecy, out of the shadows, it doesn't seem like the way you would want to do it. If it were me, what I would do is find somebody like Charles McCullough. He used to be an inspector general himself and is a big shot lawyer. And I would look for him to represent me and be the go-between between me and the government agency. And then I would reveal little things by little thing in a very controlled fashion where I was in the driver's seat, not just putting myself out there exposed to the world. By the way, Charles McCullough happens to represent David Grush.
Indeed. And I think part of the revelations that have come out is that is indeed what a lot of the whistleblowers are doing, is they're avoiding AARO altogether, and they're going directly to Congress or to different elements of the government with lawyers and whatnot to try to find other ways of disclosing this information, because they don't really trust the process. The way it's set up is a bit dodgy, like we just pointed to. But again, even beyond that, there's the question of how well-meaning, how sincere, how genuine is AARO, and specifically Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, who's heading AARO, and even the people who've appointed him. And that also maybe brings us to this next point around, is he already looking for an off-ramp, ready to look to something else, or is he perhaps being pressured to leave? Is it some combination of the two?
Yeah, that's a great point. We're going to talk about Sean Kirkpatrick, everybody's favorite doctor lately in ufology. So a lot of topics around Sean. The one that you just brought up is certainly one of the most intriguing ones. Does he have other irons in the fire right now? Maybe 1 foot out the door of AARO altogether. We did receive, or we didn't, but Christopher Sharp, the excellent reporting that he's done, he did receive a statement from Susan Goff. And her statement was, Dr. Kirkpatrick remains the director, AARO. He is not currently employed by Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which was one of the places that Ross Coulthard, or I think maybe Matt from the Good Trouble Show may have hinted at he might be working at. And then we have no AARO personnel announcements to make at this time. The typical kind of terse statement that she's known for. So it's not a, I don't know, exact statement in some ways. The rumor mill is really kind of running away right now. Is this Sean Kirkpatrick the same as that Sean Kirkpatrick? Is he staying? Is he going? A lot of people in UFO social media circles really want him to go because they do not believe that he's been a good faith actor. But I don't know. I'm a little torn on that. So Darren, what's your take on this? Do you think that there's some legitimacy to these claims? Do you think he's going to be with us before the end of the year is out?
Do you know something about his health that I don't know? No, I would say, first of all, to give a bit more context here, like you sort of suggested there, So Ross Coulthart tweeted the following. Questions have been sent to Department of Defense and DoD AARO's Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick asking if he's the same person listed as staff at ORNL, which is the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. If so, it requires explanation because the AARO boss is presumably also investigating possible Battelle links with crash retrieval/engineering programs. So in other words, the point here that Ross was asking about, and also, like you said, Matt Ford, my friend, also brought this up, and that is, Matt, I think, was the one who actually looked into the web history of the website, the Oak Ridge website, and saw that on November 1st, there had been a change where now A. Sean Kirkpatrick was listed as staff. And so this looked like a smoking gun in some ways. It was like, okay, not only is he planning his exit, but he's also already listed as staff at something, and not just anywhere. He's not going to work at Starbucks. He's going to work at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which is run by Battelle on behalf of the Department of Energy. Right? So all of these different bodies, both private and governmental and contractors working on behalf of the government through contracts, these are all the players that are in question, right? The Department of Energy has been central in this conversation over the last year or so, that many of these secrets about these programs have been buried in the Department of Energy using basically nuclear secret kind of legislation that was never meant to be used to cover up reverse engineering and UFO retrieval programs, but apparently was done that way. And that's hinted at in the Schumer legislation. Battelle is one of these contractors that people wonder if are the ones in possession of some of these craft. And yet this is all now tied to A. Sean Kirkpatrick, who presumably was listed as new staff at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, run by Battelle on behalf of the U.S. Department of Energy. So it looks like a great blockbuster movie when you hear about all those plot points. But as you just pointed out, Susan Goff, who's the spokesperson for the DoD, said, yes, Dr. Kirkpatrick remains the director of AARO. He is not currently employed by Oak Ridge National Laboratory. We have no AARO personnel announcements to make at this time. Now, as you pointed out, we know that in the position she's in with her background, she's going to say things in a very, very particular way. So she may be avoiding the most pertinent questions here, but still technically remaining truthful. We saw this happen in how she referred to Lou Elizondo, kind of avoiding the spirit of the question, but still technically staying within the legitimate truth, which is not an example of radical transparency, I'll point out there.
No, it is not.
But this is the question. So I guess, as you and I talked about before we went on the air, Kirkpatrick is not a common name, but it's not so uncommon that perhaps there is a different Sean Kirkpatrick, but it certainly is a crazy synchronicity or coincidence, whatever you want to call it, if nothing else.
Yeah, totally. Some amazing investigative reporting here. I have a love-hate relationship with things like this, Darren, because on the one hand, it's super intriguing, and it could very well be, as you said, the smoking gun. Maybe this is the same Sean Kirkpatrick that we know as the director of AARO. On the other hand, it might not be at all, and then I feel bad for this poor Sean Kirkpatrick who has nothing to do with this director of AARO, and undoubtedly this individual is going to be tracked down and ask questions, and this to me can kind of feed into the UFO social media circus that we often see. There's a rabid, I don't want to say fan base, but there's a rabid level of energy that we see within folks that are trying to get, push for disclosure. They're advocates, and they're really going to do anything that it takes. It don't matter what, who might get hurt or what questions might get asked, or, how, whether or not the truth is even the truth, or just kind of go ahead and jump to a conclusion. So I'm not necessarily a fan of that, to be honest. I feel like there's a right way to go about doing things and a professional way to go about doing things. I'm certainly not an advocate for harassing somebody. I think that that's something that has been talked about by folks like at NASA and Dr. Kirkpatrick himself. To me, the strength of our arguments, the strength of the cause, if you will, is strong enough on its own to not require that kind of behavior. So I'm just not a proponent of it. And if there's sort of sensationalism that happens, I worry that it feeds into that tendency by many.
Indeed. And I think if we just stick to the matters at hand and not the personalities, there are certainly some questions that are arising that need to be answered. You certainly could make the argument that there's, if not a disinformation program, then at least an obfuscation campaign underway. Because, for instance, some things just don't line up. We have two statements that contradict each other. Doesn't seem like that can be squared in the sense of both people are somehow telling some version of the truth. We know that sometimes you have an event and you have two people from two different perspectives might see and describe it differently because there are different perspectives. That's a multi-perspectival view, which we would champion. But in this case, you have a pretty black and white kind of matter. You have Sean Kirkpatrick saying, I did indeed reach out to David Grush, and I never heard back. You have Dave Grush saying the exact opposite. I have never received a phone call or an email. And when I actually talked to Sean Kirkpatrick soon after he took over his role and gave him some information that he should follow up on and made myself available if he wanted to call me for follow-up, I never did hear from him. So these are basically completely opposite statements. Now, again, in the same way I talked about Susan Goff and what people that are spokespeople sometimes get away with in terms of still being technically within the truth, even though they're not really following the spirit of it. Maybe, like I heard someone joke, half jokingly, but half seriously based on the history, maybe Sean Kirkpatrick left a message on LinkedIn or something for David Grush, something like that. So he's technically did reach out, but it not in a way that was transparent enough that Dave even realized that it happened. Something like that might be what's going on here, where the both statements are technically true, but in terms of the spirit of the matter, Sean Kirkpatrick really doing his darndest to try to make contact because he believes that this is information that we need to get to the bottom of. The sense here is that that's not the case. That's one aspect. Then we also have this other element, and Nick Gold tweeted about this on Twitter today, so I'm going to quote him here. And this has to do with metadata available around the Tic Tac event versus just the initial information that came out. So Nick Gold said, quote, "This transcript of yesterday's off-camera briefing between the press and Dr. Kirkpatrick of the DoD AARO is worth reading, top to bottom. Once again, Kirkpatrick says outright that there are these things, we label them UAP, which appear to be real and are not balloons, clutter, those kinds of things. They are their own category. They are genuine anomalies. Kirkpatrick's claim that there is no other data for Tic Tac other than the video contradicts Scott Bray of ONI's testimony to Congress last year. He said, we have data on that, and it remains unresolved." We're talking about Scott Bray there. He said this to Congress. "I would like to see declassification of the IC intelligence assessment on what the Tic Tac may have been, all possibilities, all levels of certainty. Certainly such a thing has got to exist in the classified realm. I'm glad Tic Tac was brought up by a reporter on this call. Keep pressing," unquote. Some great points made there. Again, these two statements don't seem to be able to exist in the same universe without being challenged. Either there is additional data or there isn't. On the one hand, Kirkpatrick says there's not, but then Scott Bray, in testimony to Congress, said we have data on that and it remains unresolved. So again, how do these things square together?
Indeed. I'm reminded as well how Senator Gillibrand, this was several weeks back, basically made a statement to the effect of she really wanted to get Dr. Kirkpatrick and David Grush in a room together so they could have this conversation. Now, not long after she said that, it's like her interest in the topic in some ways seemed to fizzle in other public statements she made. So that alone makes me quite curious. How do we go from a very enthusiastic supporter of the process, even calling for getting these two people to meet face-to-face where she might be present, or just arranging the meeting, to then not advocating for that at all, basically forgetting that that's even happened? These are the things that are very frustrating as an outsider looking in. You've got individuals that are public, they've come forward, they claim to have information, they claim to be willing to receive information, and the adults in the room are just saying, well, geez, why can't you guys just get together and share the information that you're both talking about?
Well, let's not forget that apparently this matter about the history of human civilization came down to plane tickets.
Exactly. It just didn't have...
Literally, I think one of her statements was, well, apparently Dave Grush is not able to fly here on his own dollar kind of thing, and we don't have funding for that. So this matter that goes to the very nature of reality, who we are and whether we're alone, all these matters, ends up like going down the toilet for the lack of a plane ticket, it just seems, again, preposterous.
It does. And I think therein lies the mystery of this. It's not the simple answer that you see the kind of the skeptic throw around is the reason we're seeing little movement is because there's really nothing here, and politicians are kind of giving some lip service to this, even though there's not really, a fire here at all. But the way I look at this, and I think you do too, is there's this kind of dance happening. There's a dance happening with the bureaucrats in terms of how they're managing this information, managing both the receiving and the dissemination of the information. Keep in mind that these are, the figureheads of massive bureaucracies and institutions. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening behind the scenes that these institutions are either going to be for or against, and they're going to push on certain timelines and pull back from others. They can control the speed, in other words, at which some of this progresses. And I think it's important to not lose sight of that. And not every person in that chain of decision making even has to be aware of what those pressures are. The pressure can come from a very high level. By the time it gets down to that public spokesperson, all they know is, you know what, geez, we got a scheduling conflict. The guy didn't get a good deal on a plane ticket, and so we just can't make this happen. We're going to push this back for 6 weeks, and then we'll make it happen then. Coincidentally, the timing at that point is much better for, X, Y, Z reasons that aren't even known to the rest of us, right? So this is just another layer in the frustration that people feel. I get it. Why can't we just get all this stuff on the table and have it resolved? But, I tend to believe that it's, as I mentioned on the last show, a lot of this has to do with that kind of slow release. There's a very controlled, slow release of information. Again, whether that's known by even people like Kirsten Gillibrand or Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, I don't know. I just believe that there is a kind of a slow walking that is occurring here that is enabled by some of the deeper players in this game that we don't necessarily have line of sight to.
Indeed. And I think where we can sort of end this part of the show and move on to the next segment is this. A couple things I would say. Number one, regarding Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick and AARO, again, people are asking whether or not he's been for a while now looking for an exit. He doesn't want this position, basically. Not only does he want to make all of these cases somebody else's problem, but he wants this position to be somebody else's problem. That's one way of looking at it. I am also hearing from my sources that there's a push coming from within to remove him. And then the question becomes one of semantics. Is it about him wanting to leave, or is he being pushed out, basically, and he knows that he can read the writing on the wall and is already looking for an exit? I think both are probably true. There are people definitely trying to resist this from becoming public knowledge, but equally so, there are also people really invested in this, even within government, and they are also tired of the antics with AARO. And again, even if some of it's explainable, if this was a private company running their business like this, there would be so many debacles you could point to already that surely they wouldn't stick around if they were, people that were employed by a private contractor or something. Again, like we said last time, the website's technically up, but that's about it. It's not a very impressive website. And again, they are, like you said, checking off the boxes to the minimum, but that's it. Again, for something that's so groundbreaking and potentially civilization shattering, it's just really preposterous the way it's being met. So I think we should expect changes there, and I think quite likely that will be sooner than later. Lastly, what I would point to again, I think the ace up our sleeve is the Schumer legislation. And what I'm hearing is that there's a good chance that that's going to pass. I'm hearing from the inside that people are quite confident that even though there is pushback, again, even from Congress people who are from districts where some of these contractors exist and being funded some of their campaigns by these very contractors, there's enough of a push that this is going to get passed. And again, we talked earlier about fairly green Congress people. Clearly, Chuck Schumer is not one of those people. He's one of the most powerful and experienced people in government. He understands how the system works. He's not going to push this without having talked to the White House and without having talked to other people of power to make sure this has a very good chance of getting through. So that's what I think we can look to. And I think that sets us up for a very interesting 2024.
All right. So we've gotten warmed up here. We've gotten limbered up and loose with all of these current events now behind us. Time to get serious, time to jump into the deep end. And here we're going to talk about ontology, and also related to ontology, but the models that we have around ontology that each of us have, and then the ways in which those models break and lead to what is commonly known as shock, ontological shock. We're going to go through some aspects of this topic, but before we get into some of the detail, Darren, I know you want to set the table here. So could you give us some definitions for ontology, also epistemology that comes to mind, closely related to this, and I think metaphysics?
Indeed. So bridging the two parts of the conversation here, what we were just talking about was all about the nature of disclosure. Where are we in the process towards disclosure? The second part of the show has to do with what is the nature of disclosure? What is being disclosed? What is on the table here? And again, as we've been saying for quite a while now, and our show says it, I think, more often than probably any other show, this is a much more consequential question than any other. It's not just, should disclosure happen? When is disclosure going to happen? But what is entailed in disclosure? If this is a Pandora's box that basically collapses our view of reality, our understanding of our history, our place in the universe, the finality of life and death, these kinds of things, if this is what's on the table, then this is the most important question to be really wrestling with, not just timetables. And as you say, there's kind of this circus nature sometimes within ufology of like, let's just make this happen without real pausing to say, what is on the table here and what would actually be in the best interest of our civilization and how should it be rolled out? And as we've said many times, many people have just made this the carrot they're chasing, is disclosure is going to be the thing that makes me feel fulfilled. It's going to make my life feel like it was worthwhile. We will finally be the generation that sees it happen. That, I think, is a too narrow-minded of a view. I think we have to simultaneously be asking questions as we learn more and more. And I certainly am, based on what I'm hearing, what I know now. It makes me really ask these questions. What is in the best interest of our civilization? How do you roll this out in such a way that you really consider people's well-being, not just individually, but collectively? And you think about the socio-political arrangements, and all these matters come into question because we have a very tense and tenuous kind of socio-political, geopolitical arrangement right now that's already under a lot of turmoil and stress. When you suddenly add these paradigm collapsing revelations at the same time, is that really in the best interest? I'm not saying it's necessarily not, but I'm saying at the very least, we should be asking those questions. So that takes us to the second segment here, where we discuss ontology, epistemology, metaphysics, these big words that basically speak to knowledge, how we know things, what we can know about things, how beings that are within a construct can know about the construct, how much is that limited by the fact that we are beings within a construct, those kinds of things. So yes, to your point, let's first address some definitions here. Ontology. This is the branch of metaphysics dealing with the nature of being. It's a set of concepts and categories in a subject area or domain that shows their properties and the relations between them. In brief, ontology as a branch of philosophy is the science of what is, of the kinds and structures of objects. In simple terms, ontology seeks the classification and explanation of entities. Ontology is about the object of inquiry, what you set to examine. So again, many people, when they talk about ontology, they talk about the ontology of the beings. Where are these beings coming from? And we don't just mean in terms of where in the cosmos, but is that even the right way to ask the question about where, right? And so related to that is epistemology. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge. It is concerned with the mind's relation to reality. What is it for this relation to be one of knowledge? Do we know things? And if we do, how and when do we know these things? And each of those fall within philosophy, which takes us to metaphysics, which is the branch of philosophy that deals with the first principles of things, including abstract concepts such as being, knowing, substance, cause, identity, time, and space. Derived from the Greek metaphysika, after the things of nature is what that means in Greek, referring to an idea, doctrine, or posited reality outside of human sense perception. In modern philosophical terminology, metaphysics refers to the studies of what cannot be reached through objective studies of material reality. In other words, physics tries to examine reality. Metaphysics is that which is beyond analysis. What is the nature of the underlying, undergirding substructure that gives birth to reality, basically? These are the matters that we're trying to dive in a liminal frames kind of way in this episode.
Love it. That's good stuff right there. All right, so I want to start this conversation off with what I think is a good comparison when I think about ontology and ontological models, and that is comparing this to evolutionary fitness. So when you think about evolution and the way that we've been taught that concept, you have an entity that it's not necessarily that the survival of the fittest or the strongest isn't necessarily the way that it works. It's just that they have an adaptation that makes them well suited to the particular environment that they find themselves in. That environment changes all the time, and the adaptation that they happen to have just means that they can survive and pass on their genes to the next generation within that environment. Doesn't necessarily mean they're stronger, it just means that they're well suited and fitted to the environment that they find themselves. In much the same way, ontological models work within the environment that we find ourselves. And I say models because models have existed. There have been various ontological models over the course of human history. We happen to be in a time period where we think there's a great deal of stability around the ontological model that we have. And going to the point that you raised about metaphysics, much of our current ontology almost seems to eradicate metaphysics or even presuppose that metaphysics is unnecessary because we don't need to posit a world beyond, what is. We'll just eventually figure that out and it will become what we know. So, I want to raise that because as history shows us, just looking back and looking where we are and thinking ahead, the models that you and I use to navigate the world, the ontological models that make the most sense and feel like the best fit for the world in which we find ourselves in right now, that's very likely going to change. It was different in the past. It is what we think it is now, but it's going through a period of, I think, of conflict and confrontation, and it will look different in the future. One of the failings of a lot of our thinking in our science fiction, for example, just sort of slaps a future date on a scene and says, here's 2250 in the future, and the ontological model of all the characters in that story is exactly like the ontological model that you and I have today. And I think that is not a good way to think about it. That the future is going to be so bizarre and strange, not just the way that it looks and the way people interact, but the way they think about reality itself, the way they think about ontology will be dramatically different. I would argue that we're going through a period like that now where our model is being challenged. It is being confronted, and it's starting to show cracks in the edifice. It used to be a very successful and useful, but because of the things that we're experiencing, things like the phenomena, like psi phenomena, quantum mechanics, all these different things that begin to kind of chip away at what we think is the way things are, that's going to lead to a process of change, is leading to a process of change, and will birth something entirely new. That's
Indeed.
awesome.
And I think, for those who have not listened to it yet, I would really recommend going back and listening to my conversation with Bernardo Kastrup. Again, Bernardo is a world-class philosopher who spent a lot of time digging into history, really familiarizing himself with history. And the reason why I bring that up is because we inherit certain views of the world. And like he pointed to in that conversation, we assume that our ancestors have done the real work to make sure that the presuppositions upon which we base this model that seems so firmly believed in are trustworthy. And what he points out is that no, that's not the case at all. In fact, even a long time ago, centuries ago, there was this understanding that there were some problems with this physicalist model, and yet it was used at a certain point in history for political reasons, even to do with how they were taking on the church and those kinds of things. So we have to remember that these are human enterprises, and human enterprises are never completely objective. They're always embedded in a historical context where politics comes in and those kinds of things. And sometimes when enough time goes by, and you're born in a different generation, you assume your predecessors did the right thing. They did the work. They made sure these things were solid before they passed them on to us. But that's not the case. And eventually, when you have enough generations go by, people forget about the original context altogether and just assume that the final byproduct we ended up with is trustworthy. And again, Bernardo's point is that it's not. And furthermore, his point is that in places like India, the most populous nation in the world, physicalism has never really held sway. It's really Western civilization. But even within Western civilization, it's not that old. And in the scope of human history, the notion that stuff is primary and mind or mentation or spirit is a byproduct of the matter is a very recent and short-lived kind of notion. And yet we've bought into it so entirely. And not only that, but us buying into it so entirely has led to so many of our modern problems. And again, Bernardo and I get into that, both individually and collectively. When you're told that basically your sense of who you are, everything that matters to you in terms of your subjective experience of reality, is basically just a fluke, an accident of nature, when material stuff just came together in such a way that this accident happened, and once your body dissolves, there's nothing to you. How are people supposed to feel like their life is meaningful, purposeful, and actually pull out some sort of underlying meaning from that? The bottom line is we don't have to believe that because it's not reality. And I say that because, as Bernardo has championed so well, the evidence points to the fact that physicalism is not only challenged by some aspects of reality that seem to be flying in the face of its claims, but it's basically completely untenable at this point. It is not defendable whatsoever. And we have all the evidence we need to already point to that. So this is why it's such an interesting time. And one of the things Bernardo pointed to is that as we make this transition from something like physicalism to idealism, the idea that mind is primary, that this is more like a dreamscape held within mind at large, or the mind of God, or source consciousness, these kinds of things that have been taught to us by ancient Vedantic Hindu thinking. Some of our oldest thinking in the world actually points in this direction. So we're kind of coming full circle in a way is what we're saying here. But his point was that as we shift towards this view of reality based on mind, that I think he points to would actually help us understand the UAP mystery, because that does play well with high strangeness and consciousness manipulation and perception manipulation, these aspects that we know are baked in to the experience people have with the phenomenon. That makes a lot more sense. It's very much at home in a model of reality based in mind rather than in stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yes, here. And, I would think, too, that we are going to see the birth of something that is a blend of the two ideas of physicalism and idealism. I think idealism, you and I would agree, is the best fit model for the phenomena and for how reality actually is. But that's not to say that there's a tremendous amount of benefit from physicalism and materialism. Look at the modern world that we have, the advances that we've had, the advances in standard of living, things of that nature that model has brought us. It's not like we're just going to throw that stuff out the window once we all change our perspective on reality to one that is more centered and grounded in mind instead of matter. Matter is still going to be there, and we're still going to want to manipulate it. It's just that we're going to have a different understanding of our relationship to it. I think that's really the key word there, relationship, because right now our relationship to matter is merely a byproduct of matter existing, whereas it's the other way around. In an idealistic perspective, matter is a byproduct of the fact that we are, that mind thinks and is. Matter is because of what we are. It's a very different way of framing the situation. So it's going to be an interesting future, I think, as we kind of move into that space. And we're testing a lot of theories. This is one of the things, Darren, that we won't talk about this explicitly, but I one of the reasons I'm very attracted to ufology generally is it is a space in which this kind of thinking can take place. And we are, in a way, like in a laboratory of ideas, being able to push these models in directions that I believe they need to go. And you can't do that if you're having conversation in consensus space. If you're having conversation in what society has deemed okay, normal, acceptable conversation, you're just going to remain within the guardrails of the current model that we have in the West, that physicalist understanding. Allowing yourself to play outside the margins does give you that permission to push the boundaries and I think move the conversation forward in new and exciting ways. And it's going to change. History, again, has shown us that it always does. And there are always those folks that push it in that direction. I just feel like we're kind of in a privileged place to be able to have that conversation and kind of push that in a positive direction.
I absolutely agree. I think we are on the cutting edge, and we are in a space that's asking the most relevant questions, the most significant questions. And we're doing that because we're dealing with, in a very real way, pragmatic way, data that seems to be calling into question the mainstream view. One of the points that Bernardo made in our conversation that was really fascinating, and I think should be taken very, very seriously in this discussion around how these matters are dealt with in society, in the mainstream, in academia. His point was that we have a fascination right now with closure. We don't believe that there's meaning or purpose behind our lives anymore under a physicalist model. So instead, we make a god of closure. We want to know exactly why things are, even if they're completely purposeless in the end. So what that comes down to is operations like what we have at CERN with the particle accelerator. We're trying to understand the way that even the most minute elements, particles of reality, work together. Now, what's interesting in his point is that we actually tend to go by habit as a species. We also tend to go with what works most of the time. So the thing is, and this points to what you were discussing earlier with technology, how basically the physicalist paradigm has given birth to a remarkable period of history where we've transformed the natural world. Technology has changed our lives in so many, many ways. So there's been some negative implications that have sort of come about as well, but we can't deny the fact that modernity has produced some remarkable things. Extended lifespans and improved health and made so many things easier, even though it's created its own series of problems. But his point is that the way we are wired for wanting to believe we have the full picture, we will take a model that works most of the time and say, yeah, good enough, because that feeling of closure is so precious to us. I've spoken about this before, how Rupert Sheldrake has talked about this. What he sees is more like habits of nature rather than laws of nature. And those habits, I would even go a step further and say, are byproducts of moves in consciousness. And so as consciousness shifts, those habits shift basically as a consequence. But Rupert talks about times where he would actually go to a scientific laboratory and ask about why certain supposed constants weren't actually being measured anymore. They were actually just written in as assumptions. And so he said, well, this is a constant, yes, but you're not measuring for it anymore. And they said, well, yes, because sometimes we actually saw anomalies in the data. And he said, well, that sounds like an important revelation that we should try to make sense of. Maybe that's telling us something about our models being inappropriate or, insufficient in some way. And the guy was like, well, no, we know these constants they're a thing, so let's just write it in and assume it's the case, which again, of course, flies in the face of scientific inquiry. This is a black swan, if you will, saying to us, something's wrong in your model, or this constant should not on occasion change, right? So this gets to what Bernardo was talking about, where if we have situations that work most of the time, models that work most of the time, we get stuck by our own choice. We will say, good enough, these anomalies that exist must be outliers. There will eventually be some day that we can explain it. You have many physicalists who make these promissory notes saying one day we'll understand how the brain produces consciousness. They've been saying that for decades and decades and decades. We are no closer to having any kind of notion of how that works. We're farther away than we've ever been, but they're still not really acknowledging it, right? And so Bernardo made this really fascinating suggestion that perhaps high strangeness, speaking of what you're talking about, in terms of us as a ufological community engaging with really interesting data that pushes our sense of what is reality. His point was that high strangeness might be the way that nature or overarching mind interjects new data to force us out of the rut we've got ourselves in. Because not only is it incomplete in terms of understanding reality, but it's creating these evolutionary pressures that could destroy our civilization. So staying in this rut is consequential in more than one way. And so actually high strangeness is a way that the construct itself, which may be conscious in itself, actually interjects this data meant to knock us out of the current model, basically. Really fascinating. And this speaks again to what he talked about there, where basically we are very, very stubborn in our ability to consider new notions. And this goes to Arthur Schopenhauer's famous quote. And I remember I quoted this at the end of my presentation at the Anomalous Conference in New York City last year. He said, quote, "All truth passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident," unquote. That's who we are as a species. We never say, we've learned our lesson. We've done that like 1,700 times. This time, let's keep an open mind. Let's not land the plane, as Jeff Kripal would say. Let's keep an open mind. Let's keep our options open. Let's have a Zen mind, beginner's mind kind of perspective. No, we latch on to the latest notions and we assume they are correct. And not only that, but when we are presented with data that seems to question those, we first ridicule that. Hello, ufology. We remember this being part of the 20th century. Second, violent opposition, right? In other words, it's not just that they ridicule it. When they really feel like now the pressure is mounting and their model is about to collapse, they actually can become violent in their opposition to it. This is how much we want models and a relationship to the models rather than to reality itself. And then third, it is accepted as being self-evident because eventually you have a generation that realizes this is just the way things are, and they are not attached to those form models like previous generations were, which goes to what sometimes people in religious circles talk about. Very ancient religious circles like Eastern Orthodox will often say, if you don't like the current bishop, just wait for the funeral. This is the kind of way it works, right? Like revolutions happen one funeral at a time. Even Dean Radin's talked about how he's much more likely to be able to publish papers about psi phenomena today in mainstream journals than he was 20, 30 years ago. And when people ask him why, he's like, well, it's a younger generation that are part of the editorial boards behind these publications. And the younger generation is more open to these ideas than previous ones. This says a lot about who we are as we intersect with the UFO phenomenon and paranormality.
Yeah, well said. We, in many ways, we're kind of like a square peg, and we've been able to fit through many of the square holes that exist, the square openings that exist for a long time. Now we're bumping up against that round hole, and we can't quite get through it. So, there's more reality yet to be explored, but we have to be willing to change the way that we are to pass through it, the way that we view it to get through. There's a comfort level in our model right now. There's a this is the nature of consensus. As you navigate the world with other people who view the world the way you do, there are so many things in all of our lives that we take for granted as just being, that's the way we do things. That this disgusts me, this brings me pleasure. Why do these things make you feel this way? Well, that's because in that consensus model, you've been conditioned to think those certain things. That's not the way it has to be. And anyone who's traveled, to another country with a different culture, who's been exposed to different cultural practices or foods or all, any kind of thing that's not within your normal bound, you'll know what I'm talking about. You kind of have a visceral, like you talked about, a violent, almost opposition to what you are being given and presented with, and then eventually you come around and go, I actually kind of like this food, and I feel like my model of reality has expanded because of that exposure, and it wasn't comfortable. I didn't go through that process and really enjoy it initially, but I came out the other end by having a more fulsome understanding of the way the world actually is, and that gives me a deeper appreciation for the different contours of reality than I had before. So that's essentially where we're going, and kind of what we're trying to do here is advocate for that type of change. And if we talked about before, or I guess one idea that's been bounced around, I think you hear Dr. Diana Pasulka talk about this quite a bit, or she mentions that she gets asked this question quite a lot, is about that religion question. And we hear a lot of folks, many from the outside, kind of critiquing ufology, that this sounds like the formation of a new religion, that there will be this sort of religion of the UFO. And of course, as we all know in the West, religion is a bit of a pejorative. So when they're using that as a comparison, they're not doing that in a very positive or charitable way. They're doing that in a way meant to demean the entire enterprise. But her sort of response to that is that it's not creating something new, that this has always been happening. That religion, if you look at the history of religion and what we see being reflected in religious text, is it's individuals, just like individuals in ufology, who have been trying to wrestle with the strange things that happen in the realm of human experience, but that don't reside in consensus experience at large. So they're trying to fit those things, in to that larger human experience and make it so that, they can be commonly accepted or practiced or observed. And what that is the appearance of religious practice.
Indeed, it's a fascinating question, and it's right at the heart of liminal frames, because of our backgrounds and because we came together recognizing that we both have a theological background, but we also are fascinated by the UFO phenomenon and recognize that these meaning models that are formed in relationship with our experience of reality create these central questions. And that really was the locus for the beginning of liminal frames. One of the things, to your point there, to keep in mind is, number one, based on what I just said about how much we violently oppose at times new models, I want people to really sit with that, because I see so many people in the ufology space saying, listen, I think when people figure this stuff out, find out that it's real, they'll just accept it. Now, on the one hand, I understand that people have this frustration that even when revelations do come out, like what David Grush has said, even when the government comes out and says UFOs are a real thing, we don't know what they are, we don't know where they come from, still, the average person on the street's not really becoming fascinated. It's not becoming their pet obsession like it is for so many of us. So they assume, therefore, that when these revelations are made public about the real depth of what's involved with disclosure, speaking to our earlier part of the conversation, they assume people will be okay with it. They'll either be bored and be like, whatever, that's fine, I'm going on, I've got work to do, or whatever. But I think we need to remember what we just talked about. When models are challenged, people can become violent. People are very, very attached to their models. We, especially in the West, have even divorced ourselves from our body. So we're very cerebral in how we think about reality and think about ourselves. And that's basically all about referencing a model. And much of what I even talk about in the class is about how to actually restore that ability to have a direct understanding and relationship with reality. And when you can do that, there's actually vast amounts of information all around you all the time. And we've actually assumed that the cerebral relationship with reality is the only one available. It certainly isn't. And it's actually a very truncated understanding. Certainly it gives you a consistent feedback, but that's because you're narrowing the tunnel of availability so much that only a certain kind of information will come through. And then you turn around and say, aha, that's all that reality is. Again, it's kind of a circular reasoning going on there. But another thing I want to point out regarding religion, when people say, will religion survive the revelations of the UFO phenomenon? What they don't recognize is that religion has already survived many, many shifts in societal understanding. Again, we're talking about materialism, reductionistic materialism, physicalism being a fairly new kind of notion of reality. Religion preceded that, and it's still around during it, and it will still be around after it. So I think people need to recognize that the faulty assumption in that question is that religion has been one thing up till now, and then the question is, will it survive after this revelation? It's morphed and modified many, many times, and sometimes split off into sister versions of that religion many, many times, right? We have Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism splitting off. You have Protestantism, then you have evangelicals, then mainline Christians. I mean, it goes on and on and on. You know, you have all these different versions coming out of this initial seed, right? And so that's been happening all along. In other words, whenever new information is introduced, you either see basically a way to incorporate that information and subtly shift, or you see a split happen and a new version emerges that is more in line with that new understanding. But the point being that religion has morphed and evolved all along the entire scope of human history. That will also happen regardless of what the revelations of the UFO phenomenon are.
Yeah, and let's not forget that even though we've created a category called religion, those who are non-religious, that's another category, have their own beliefs about how the world behaves and how the world is, as if there's some sort of objective truth of the non-religious perspective in opposition to the religious perspective. And really, that's a false dichotomy. Like, and to some degree, that's why I sort of hate the fact that we even have a concept of religion as something separate from just general ontologies. So because everybody has their own perspective on what is real, and just the religious perspective contains some different sets of belief than the non-religious perspective. So we're all, in other words, religious, if you want to look at it from a different angle. And I think that's something to not lose sight of. And that will always be the case if our knowledge about reality is incomplete. because we will always posit a model of reality that includes the things which we do not know, but seemingly can sort of correlate to from what we can observe. And you and I have talked about this a lot. That is, as consciousness perhaps evolves. I'm not even talking about after death and getting into that entire aspect of it. Just as a consciousness develops, it goes through this process, and it continues going through this process. That as it matures, it gains greater knowledge about the environment that it finds itself in. It creates a new model about that environment, one that is generally efficacious to the environment that it finds itself in. It works, in other words. And as that individual, that conscious entity continues maturing and gaining experience within reality, the model itself continues to change. And it's not a process that really ever stops. It just keeps going. So I don't know, what do you want to talk to that or speak to that at all? Because I feel like that's a big part of this, that it's not that we're not going to arrive at a point of definitive knowledge where no more questions exist. Like it's baked into the very nature of the system.
Indeed. And I would say, not only do I agree with that, but I would scale that out in terms of infinity, basically. So I've spoken before about how I find the raw contact material to be very credible information. It fits with many ancient Vedantic and Hindu perspectives, Buddhist perspectives on the nature of reality. It seems to be consistent with the revelations emerging from quantum mechanical experiments. It fits with experiences I've had and communication I've had with different kinds of intelligence. And what many of these say is that even ones that are sort of channeling information to people, and they may be at a much higher level in the spiral dynamic of the evolution of consciousness, they will also say, we humbly submit this to you, that this is what we understand at our perspective, but there are levels beyond us that we do not understand yet. And this just goes on and on and on. This is, I think, baked into reality is an open-ended question, which, if you think about it, is a much more interesting way to exist. But also, I think, to your earlier point about how people kind of laughingly, I think, from our perspective, make this assumption that you're either religious or you're not. Like it's a Boolean, what we would say in programming, right? It's a true or false statement. There's no such thing. Everyone has some sort of basic metaphysical system of belief. You have to, because we just don't know enough about reality yet for that not to be in place. And so for any of us to get up in the morning and move about the world, we have to have made some metaphysical assumptions. And Bernardo's point again is that because physicalism has been with us for a while, and because it's been so efficacious, to use your favorite word, in terms of changing the reality that we live in, people have said to these scientists and whatnot, you are like the new priest. Look what you have delivered to us, right? You have delivered to us cell phones and satellites and all the wonders of modern life, right? And so because it's been so transformative in our reality experience, the assumption is, therefore, the metaphysical assumptions that underlie that must be true. But that's not at all the case. You can, as Bernardo points out so well, you can manipulate the way nature behaves and still not have real understanding about what nature is. Very different thing. Water may come down and you can take that water and you can boil it and you can cook food and you can drink and you can, do different things like set up sanitation systems. That doesn't mean you know where that water came from. You might never have gone upstream. You don't need to in order to use it in a useful way. The point being that there's been this overlooking in our modern society about the metaphysical assumptions that have been baked in to modern life. And so again, like Bernardo likes to point out, kind of hilariously, one day social scientists, historians will look back, anthropologists, cultural anthropologists will look back at this period in history and remark about how bizarre it was, how convinced we were of this model that was such an anomaly historically across the entire scope of human civilization, and how it didn't last very long because, according to Bernardo's perspective, as mine as well, we are already seeing a shift. What's believed now is very different than what was believed even 15, 20 years ago. It's not making mainstream news yet, but all of the ramifications are in play already. So yes, we would want to say to people, if you think this is about being religious or not, that's the wrong question. And even when people say, I'm spiritual but not religious, that too is another kind of religious perspective. It's a different configuration around metaphysical values, but you can't escape this metaphysical question. I think that's what we're getting to. And when you think about how much actually we are moved by these metaphysical assumptions, whether we're aware of them or not, or we have a metacognitive awareness of them or not, as a society or as individuals, they are central to our experience. They are central to the way we make sense of the world. And what the UFO phenomenon brings to the table is real questions about what the nature of that is. And you can't open that Pandora's box without going there. And that's what I think we need to think about in terms of what are the real implications of this? How do you roll this out? Can you do it in a way that you roll out some now and some later? These are the kind of questions that are going on behind the scenes, while even those people behind the scenes have different metaphysical assumptions they bring to the table. Even this panel that will be put together for 2024, that will involve people with different metaphysical assumptions. Many of them will come to the table not even being self-aware that they have metaphysical assumptions behind their reality models. This is how complicated the entire matter is.
Yeah, I'm so glad you went there because, one of the points we wanted to make is how a lot of the dominant models in ufology right now are wedded to the physicalist model. You think about the extraterrestrial hypothesis being really the prime example. That's the one that if it's announced, hey, they're just from this other star system, like that fits so neatly and perfectly into the model of reality that we have right now, that it would be easily acceptable and digestible. You just think of them as, just beings like us that live on another planet. It's easy to correlate that. But it highlights the fact that if that's not what it actually is, if it's something far more complex than that, the model itself has a defense mechanism against even entertaining that notion. So this is a huge part of the problem. You can't. You have to prepare the ground in order for these seeds to germinate. And right now we don't have the kind of fertile soil that we need for the seeds to germinate, and the seeds being the way this phenomena actually is, the way that reality actually is. So we're constantly going to be essentially like rejecting the seeds outright because, oh, no, like those seeds, they actually don't grow here. They grow in some other climate. I don't even know, is that even a seed? I'm not sure what that is. Get it out of my garden. And so if that's the position that we're going to be in, think of SETI as a great example of this. We're always looking for those radio signals from, another civilization. If I don't find the radio signal, then there must be no life out there. That's essentially where we are now. And as more information comes forward from individuals who have been working in these programs, trying to understand this mystery and are hinting at that there are layers here that are far more complex than just that basic ET kind of dynamic, that's really going to confront us and challenge us and force us perhaps to change that model in order for us to ingest the information, in order for that to change the entire enterprise. And that's not something you could just flip a switch on. We can't just make that happen overnight with some beautifully crafted speech from an executive podium.
Indeed. And so the real question is, knowing how immune we seem to be, resistant we seem to be to real challenges to our consensus model of reality, how will disclosure roll out? How do you do that? Will we see this massive defense mechanism fighting against the very data people have been clawing for decades? Basically saying, I refuse to accept that data along the lines of the seeds you're just describing, right? These are the questions. And you think about something like the Collins elite and how they have brought up the possibility that these beings are quote unquote demons, right? And this is part of some vast satanic enterprise. Now, on the one hand, you and I have really wanted to introduce some questions regarding what are the assumptions behind that view of reality that is making them interpret the data in such a way that they see it as this possibility of being demons. But while we want to point that out and say we all have to be aware of the presuppositions we bring to the table, the worldviews that we are trying to maintain, maybe not consciously trying to, but we are doing that all the time. And another point to make there, though, is that they clearly, to what you were just saying, are seeing some data that doesn't fit with space aliens, Otherwise, they wouldn't be postulating these are demons in terms of the biblical understanding of demons. So these are, again, questions we need to bring to the table when we think about what is involved in the nature of disclosure. What would make so many of these government people, insiders who are seeing some of the data firsthand, even though I've already acknowledged and said central to their assumption and their hypothesis is their predispositions to data, right, about the nature of reality. We talked about that with James Lukatsky, right, being a Catholic and that shaping the way he sees the world. Yes, we need to be aware of that. There's no such thing, as I said last time, as naked data that just gets interpreted as it is. It always has to be put through an interpretive filter to be made sense of. There's no other way to do it. So that's the first thing we need to be aware of. But the second thing we need to be aware of is what is the nature of the data that's making people jump to those conclusions? Some people might be so biased. Again, you do get some fundamentalist evangelicals, for instance, that assume there is no such being as an extraterrestrial. All there are humans and animals and angels and demons. So in that sense, it gets slotted in, not human, not animal. Okay, it's got to be a demon, right? But there are many people who are more sophisticated than that. There's something about the nature of the interaction itself, the way it is able to manipulate consciousness, the way it does seem to involve some elements of the phenomenon, some negative activity, or at least what is perceived as negative activity. So I don't want to write off that perspective altogether and say those people are completely blinded by their worldview. No, I think they are influenced by their worldview, heavily influenced, but there's something about the nature of the data that makes them go in that direction. Many of them would be open to the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Certainly Jacques Vallée, J. Allen Hynek were open to and favorable to the notion of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. That was their leading hypothesis going in. It was only the high strangeness that made them say, wait a second, something much more fundamental is in play here. And now we should be asking questions about the nature of reality, not just the nature of the phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think of Chris Mellon as well. He's very much been that ET is the best fit hypothesis that we might have here. But I feel like we're kind of seeing some signs even within his thinking that he's beginning to expand his perspective on what this might be. It makes me think a lot about the work of John Mack, in the institute that you're involved with now. Here was a man who took this inner experience that people were having, that it was not just an experience that took place in their psyche as well. I mean, it had real, in many cases, physical aspects to it. We would call, a physical dynamic to the experience. But he took these individuals seriously, and that's probably part of this, right? That's why there's so much of that taking place, because if the model is going to change in a way that is sort of at the base level or widespread, you would want it to be interacting with us where it matters the most, and that is, in our inner worlds and in our personal sphere of experience. So, I tend to think that disclosure, getting us to that model that we've been talking about here, is really kind of a give and take, a combination of things that the government knows, things that we would look at and go, these do fit within the model of the world that we understand, but also incorporate or take seriously or work to assimilate these inner experiences, these individual experiences that are quite disparate on the surface, but add to whatever this is. And so that to me is the biggest challenge, right? How do you, because as you well know, the experiences that we're talking about here really run the gamut. There are some common themes, but the way that it manifests itself from individual to individual is not as consistent as it would need to be for us to kind of satisfy that, replicate it in a lab standard that our materialism would want. So how do we bring these two things together? And I think it really comes from a place, you'll appreciate this, of kind of radical transparency and vulnerability. There's a vulnerability in the entire enterprise that has to be brought to bear. The government has to be vulnerable and say, these are things that we know. These are things that we don't know. We are open-minded to these other aspects of it. And the public will respond to that, because that is the kind of invitation that is needed for the people who have been who have felt like they've been belittled or don't have a place in society because of the experiences that they've had, that will make them feel comfortable to come forward and bring their experience, bring their knowledge, and incorporate that into the entire body. And then that gives us that opportunity to examine it in a wholesome way and hopefully advance the model.
Indeed, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up John Mack. And I think about people like him and Jeff Kripal and Jacques Vallée to some degree, in the sense of even Bernardo, in my conversation with him, admitted that the revelations that came forward with David Grush's testimony challenged some of his assumptions about what the phenomenon represents. He discussed in the first part of my conversation with him that he had an anomalous experience when he was young. And it was so bizarre and absurd that he basically concluded that nature doesn't have to be rational and doesn't have to follow these axioms of logic that we set up as a species, as a monkey species, as he would say. And maybe what happens sometimes is we get that irrationality that it also exists in nature that bleeds through sometimes. And this is why he was so embracing of the high strangeness. In fact, he would say, if a certain case sounds too science fiction and doesn't involve elements of high strangeness, he would actually question the credibility of that person more than he would someone who said some things like Joe Simonton, who had this experience with beings that landed and offered him pancakes, right? So that sounds absurd, preposterous. But what he's pointing to is that seems to be part and parcel with the phenomenon. It happens. Absurdity is part of it, and we have to make sense of it. That led to his book, Meaning in Absurdity. But I also want to point out that Bernardo, Jeff Kripal, John Mack, all these people to some degree, coming from either a social science perspective or a psychological perspective, in the case of John Mack, knowing that people can create notions in their mind. That's part of what we have to make sense of here. Many people wanted to sort of keep the phenomenon in like a third realm, that sometimes there's this third realm that kind of interjects into our reality and we experience, but it's not really in the usual reality where you and I sit on chairs and drive cars and see clouds floating by. They think it's fundamentally some other kind of realm that sometimes intersperses with this one. And yet the revelations that came forward with David Grush about craft sitting in hangars for 8 decades and bodies supposedly sitting in freezers, or whatever nature biologics points to there, this seems to be very much part of our physical reality. And many of the experiencers I know, including the abductees that John worked closely with, actually challenged some of his assumptions back in the 90s and said, listen, these beings came into my room, leaned on my bed, my mattress depressed. I felt their skin, right? It felt like mushrooms, right? When it brushed up against mine. This is in our physical reality in some way. And to Bernardo's credit, and we need to see more people doing this, when I confronted him with that data, he said, well, then maybe this is more than one thing. Maybe what I experienced with the absurdity is not the same thing that's producing the craft and hangars and the bodies and freezers. That's the kind of open-mindedness we need, open-endedness to say we shouldn't, again, too quickly leap to conclusions because we want a model that gives us closure. If the data points to many different origin sources and different kinds of beings that point to different windows on reality, we should keep that open as long as we need to until the data itself is really giving us conclusive evidence pointing in a new direction. That's kind of what needs to be in play here. And this is why we need people from different disciplines, different mindsets, different reality paradigms, all being involved, because all of that's going to be needed and probably more. Also information and encouragement and prompts given by these others, and perhaps even by mind at large itself in terms of the construct being conscious. All of that probably is what's going to be involved and what is involved as we speak, as we go through this revolution.
Amen. You know, it can't just feed into our consumerism. You know, it can't just feed into our need to exert military power. These are the drivers, quite frankly, of our world right now. Spend money, acquire things, protect those things at all costs. So that a lot of the drive should be no surprise that a lot of the drive behind disclosure from many fits right into those same motivators. And the point that you made is just so, to me, so important to reiterate. We have to challenge the entire enterprise. And it requires a multi-perspectival, multidisciplined approach, and it requires infinite open-mindedness. And the real problem with the world we have now is the model that runs the world has no space for that. Because what we're talking about there is something that has an inherent level of weakness to it when you hold it up against the model that we all live in and many of us champion. So until we are ready to be vulnerable and expose ourselves to that kind of uncertainty and live in a place of uncertainty and mystery, until we learn to reclaim the beauty of mystery, we're really not going to be ready for whatever this is, and not even have the mindset and the tools and the right perspective, the right impetus to take the journey at all. This is the challenge in front of us.
Well said. And I would finish with a couple of points. Number one, again, some of the information I received from people that are intimately involved with this on the inside sometimes points to certain books, certain documents that exist in the public sphere, but kind of are flying below radar. No one is really aware of them. But sometimes when you can't say things and get it past the DoD, you can publish fiction that kind of points to realities that exist and are known to exist. And I've discussed a couple of different books over the course of the history of POC that basically play that role. There's another book that I'm reading right now that has come from those circles that probably will end up being a POC episode at some point. But in that book, there's this notion of something called a zone of annihilation. And it has to do with basically not just challenging some of your assumptions about reality, but obliterating them, which leads to this tweet I made. We don't call it a tweet anymore right now, post, right, on X. This is so awkward. I said, quote, "The expression zone of annihilation relates to how, for insiders, the implications of psi, high strangeness, and the nonlinear acausal nature of time, etc., obliterate mainstream Western worldviews. Reality is not what we were taught," unquote. This is what this really gets to. And to your point, to pair it up with that, we should see that as an invitation to adventure, to embracing mystery. We think about being like children again. Jesus and many other sacred saints and sages of history have said, you need to take on the perspective of a child, not because they are ignorant, but because they're open-minded and they embrace the adventure. When they see a door, they don't just see a door, they say a door, because it's like, what does that lead to? That open-endedness, that sense of the sacred adventure of life, knowing that we will never, no matter how far we get, no matter how much our models evolve, there will always be more to embrace and learn about. And that's why adventure, I think, is key to the entire enterprise.
You know, I'm all about adventure, and our listeners are as well. We very much appreciate everybody who's been with us on this journey, those of you who've been with us from the beginning, and those of us who may be joining us right now. We're grateful to have you along with us on the path. May the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.